Wealthy black woman faces racist neighbors, but they're shocked when she invites the mayor to her home. As Mrs. Johnson settled into her beautiful new home, she couldn't shake the feeling that her neighbors were watching her every move. It all came to a head when she found a nasty note tucked under her door: "You don't belong here. You should move." Instead of feeling defeated, something inside her sparked. With a determined smile, she decided to host a neighborhood gathering. But this wasn't just any get-together. She had a surprise in store that would leave her racist neighbors utterly shocked. She was inviting the mayor, and she couldn't wait to see their faces when he showed up. Mrs. Johnson stood outside her new home, the weight of boxes in her arms and excitement in her heart. After years of hard work and saving every penny, she was finally here, living in a beautiful, upscale neighborhood she had always dreamed about. The colonial house was a beauty, with its crisp white paint and a front porch that beckoned for evenings spent sipping iced tea while catching up with friends. But as she unloaded her belongings, the warmth of her excitement quickly dimmed. It didn't take long for her to notice the stares. The neighbors, mostly white families, peeked through their curtains and whispered among themselves. At first, she thought it was just curiosity. After all, she was the new face in a place that probably hadn't changed much over the years. But soon, the whispers turned into pointed looks and cold shoulders. Every time she walked her dog, she felt the tension thick in the air. Other pet owners would yank their leashes tighter, avoiding eye contact, while kids would stop playing, staring at her like she was a ghost. It stung more than she cared to admit. She had always been proud of her achievements and the life she built for herself, yet here she was, feeling like an outsider in her own home. Then came the note. It arrived on a dreary Tuesday, the kind of day that usually called for cozy comfort food. As she stepped outside to grab the mail, a crumpled piece of paper fluttered to the ground. Frowning, she picked it up, expecting to find some promotional flyer. But as she unfolded it, her heart sank. "You don't belong here. Move out or face the consequences." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She stared at the note, disbelief flooding her senses. Had she really come this far only to be met with such blatant hatred? This wasn't just a neighborhood, it was a fortress of exclusion, and she was the unwelcome visitor. Anger swelled inside her, but more than that, it ignited a fierce determination. Mrs. Johnson wasn't one to back down from a challenge. She had faced discrimination before, and she refused to let the narrow-minded views of a few dictate her life. Instead of cowering in fear, she decided to confront this issue head-on. She would show them that she was just as worthy of belonging as anyone else. That night, she sat down with a pen and some stationery, her heart racing with each stroke of the pen. This wouldn't be a passive response. She envisioned a neighborhood gathering, an event that would bring everyone together. But this was going to be different. She'd invite the mayor. After all, she had connections from her days of community work, and if anyone could help her bridge the divide, it was someone with authority. The idea sent a rush of excitement through her. She could already picture the shocked expressions on her neighbors' faces when they learned she had ties to someone so important. This was her chance to break the ice and show everyone who she really was. Once the invitations went out, she felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. Would her neighbors embrace this effort or continue their disdain? Regardless of their reactions, she was committed to making a stand. If they wanted to judge her by the color of her skin, they'd have to do it in front of the mayor himself. As the days passed, she prepared her home for the gathering. She decorated with vibrant flowers and set the table with her best china. In the kitchen, she cooked up a storm, pouring love into every dish, from her family's secret barbecue ribs to creamy coleslaw and sweet cornbread. This was more than just a meal, it was a piece of her culture, a symbol of her willingness to share and connect. When the big day finally arrived, Mrs. Johnson stood at her doorstep, heart pounding. The sun was shining, and the scent of her cooking wafted through the air. As the first neighbors arrived, she greeted them with open arms, determined to create a warm, inviting atmosphere. Yet she could sense their hesitation. They seemed uneasy, eyeing her like she was an alien from another planet. "Welcome. I'm so glad you could come," she said, forcing a bright smile as she gestured to the spread of food. The initial smiles were polite but strained. She noticed how they lingered at the edges, reluctant to engage. Still, she pressed on, determined to make this night a success. She shared stories about her life, her career, and her love for cooking, trying to draw them out of their shells. Slowly, laughter began to fill the space, melting away some of the tension. Neighbors who had been cold started to open up, discovering common interests and shared experiences. Just as the night was beginning to feel like a success, the moment she had been waiting for finally arrived. The mayor walked in, and instantly, all eyes turned to him. Mrs. Johnson's heart raced. This was the moment she had planned for. "Good evening, everyone," he greeted, his voice booming with warmth. "I'm thrilled to be here tonight to support my friend, Mrs. Johnson." His presence shifted the energy in the room. Whispers erupted as the neighbors exchanged glances of disbelief. Mrs. Johnson felt a wave of pride wash over her. The mayor's words were like magic, breaking down walls and creating space for understanding. He spoke about community, inclusivity, and the importance of embracing diversity. As he praised Mrs. Johnson for her commitment to making their neighborhood a better place, she felt hope surge within her. Maybe, just maybe, this night could be the turning point they all needed. As the evening wore on, she watched her neighbors engage with the mayor, their skepticism melting away under his charm and authority. Conversations flowed, laughter echoed, and for the first time since she moved in, Mrs. Johnson felt a genuine connection forming. By the end of the night, she stood at her door, watching her neighbors leave with smiles on their faces. It was a sight she had longed to see. They were no longer strangers, they were her neighbors, and she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced before. But deep down, she knew the battle wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, and some might still hold onto their biases, yet, she was determined to keep forging connections and breaking down barriers. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for her family and the community she wanted to build. As she closed the door behind her, Mrs. Johnson smiled to herself. This was just the beginning. She had taken a stand, and with the support of her community, she believed they could create a neighborhood where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their background. As the weeks passed after the mayor's visit, the initial warmth from the neighborhood gathering began to fade, revealing the undercurrents of tension that still rippled beneath the surface. While some neighbors were genuinely interested in getting to know Mrs. Johnson, others seemed increasingly agitated by her presence. It was as if they had momentarily forgotten their prejudices, only to have them resurface with a vengeance. Mrs. Johnson noticed the little things, the subtle shifts in demeanor, the way some families would avoid eye contact as they walked past her front yard, the whispers that quickly ceased whenever she turned to greet them. It wasn't long before the passive-aggressive tactics began. A neighbor she had once thought friendly started to leave her trash can out for days, making it a point to show that Mrs. Johnson's presence bothered him. Then came the complaints. First, it was about the garden. Mrs. Johnson's vibrant flowers were out of place in the otherwise subdued aesthetic of the neighborhood. Next, they claimed her car was parked too close to the curb, even though it was well within the lines. It was clear they were desperate to find any reason to push her out. One morning, she received a formal notice from the Homeowners Association, citing multiple complaints about her property. The letter accused her of violating neighborhood regulations, claiming her garden was an eyesore and that her decorations were overly ostentatious. Mrs. Johnson sat at her kitchen table, the letter crumpled in her hands, feeling the sting of injustice. How could they be so cruel? She took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was not just a reflection of her, it was a manifestation of their own insecurities. Instead of allowing the negativity to consume her, she resolved to take the high road. With a newfound determination, Mrs. Johnson began to organize her thoughts. She decided that her response would not be anger or frustration, but rather an opportunity to showcase her resilience. She knew she had to stay composed, to smile and greet her neighbors as she always had, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. But maintaining her composure wasn't easy. Each time she stepped outside, she felt their eyes on her, the scrutiny weighing heavily on her shoulders. Yet she persisted, greeting them with a warm smile, even when they barely returned the gesture. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," she called out to a neighbor who rushed past her, clutching a grocery bag as if it were a lifeline. The woman's eyes narrowed, but she simply muttered a half-hearted greeting in return. Mrs. Johnson felt the frustration bubble inside her but pushed it down, determined to stay true to her values. Over time, her unwavering kindness only seemed to frustrate her neighbors more. They could see how her positivity didn't waver, and it ate away at them. The glares intensified, and the whispers grew louder. It became a strange dance of animosity and resilience, one that Mrs. Johnson was determined to lead. Then, one evening, the tension reached a boiling point. Mrs. Johnson had just finished tending to her garden when she noticed a commotion down the street. Curious, she walked closer to see a small crowd gathering in front of the Johnsons' home, a family who had lived there for years. As she approached, she realized they were arguing with another neighbor, Mr. Stevens, who had been one of the most vocal opponents of her presence. The scene was chaotic, with accusations flying back and forth, and the air crackling with anger. "Your kids are always running onto my lawn," Mr. Stevens shouted, pointing an accusing finger. The Johnsons countered, "They're just playing. You need to lighten up." The tension in the air was palpable. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, a mix of fear and frustration swirling within her. But something inside her stirred, compelling her to step forward. "Excuse me," she said, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the chaos. "Can we all take a moment to breathe? We're neighbors, after all. We should be able to talk about this without it escalating." Mr. Stevens turned to her, his expression hardening. "This is none of your business, Mrs. Johnson. Why don't you just go back to where you came from?" The words hit her like a slap, but she refused to let them define her. Instead, she met his gaze firmly, her heart racing. "Actually, it is my business. I live here now, just like you. And I want to help make this neighborhood better for everyone." For a moment, silence fell over the crowd. The Johnsons looked at her with surprise, as if they hadn't expected her to speak up. She continued, her voice steady and confident. "We all want a peaceful place to live, right? Let's find a way to resolve this without animosity." As she spoke, she felt a flicker of hope. If she could bridge the gap between the neighbors, maybe she could pave the way for understanding and acceptance. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the tension eased. Mr. Stevens's posture relaxed slightly, and the Johnsons nodded in agreement. "You're right. Maybe we can talk this through," Mr. Stevens muttered begrudgingly, still avoiding her gaze. The confrontation ended with a tentative agreement to discuss the issue further, and as the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Johnson felt a small sense of victory. Perhaps it was a turning point, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had settled over her life. With that confrontation behind her, Mrs. Johnson decided it was time to take her efforts to the next level. She began planning a neighborhood potluck, an event that would encourage everyone to come together and share not just food, but stories, experiences, and hopefully, laughter. As she spread the word, she encountered mixed reactions. Some neighbors seemed eager to join in, while others gave her dubious looks, still clinging to their prejudices. But Mrs. Johnson didn't let that deter her. "Let's put aside our differences and celebrate our community," she told those who showed interest. She stressed how important it was to know one another beyond the labels that had been placed upon them. On the day of the potluck, Mrs. Johnson filled her kitchen with mouth-watering aromas. She prepared her family's special fried chicken, sweet potato casserole, and a peach cobbler that had always been a crowd favorite. As she arranged the tables outside, she felt a mix of nerves and excitement. Would her neighbors show up? Would they be willing to share their lives with her? To her delight, families began arriving, carrying dishes of their own and exchanging smiles as they mingled. It was a sight she had longed for, a tapestry of diverse backgrounds coming together under one roof. At first, the conversations were tentative, polite small talk, but slowly, the atmosphere warmed. Mrs. Johnson made her rounds, engaging with everyone, sharing her stories, and encouraging others to do the same. She learned about the history of the neighborhood, about the families that had lived there for generations, and about the struggles they had faced. As the sun set, the gathering grew louder with laughter and animated discussions. The children played together, their differences forgotten as they chased one another in the fading light. Mrs. Johnson stood back, watching the scene unfold with a smile on her face. This was the community she had dreamed of, a place where acceptance and friendship blossomed. But amid the joy, she noticed a familiar figure lingering at the edge of the crowd, Mr. Stevens. He seemed reluctant to join, arms crossed over his chest as he observed from a distance. Mrs. Johnson felt a pang of sympathy. He had been so hostile towards her, but perhaps there was more to him than met the eye. Summoning her courage, she walked over to him, determined to break through the barriers he had erected around himself. "Hi, Mr. Stevens. I'm glad you could make it," she said, her voice friendly. He looked surprised, his expression softening just a fraction. "I didn't know what to expect," he admitted, glancing at the gathering. "It's all about community," she replied, gesturing toward the laughter and camaraderie around them. "We can't move forward if we keep building walls." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I guess I've been on edge since you moved in. I didn't want things to change." Mrs. Johnson nodded, understanding his fears. "Change can be daunting, but it doesn't have to be a bad thing. We can adapt together. You're not alone in this." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the families mingle, the children laughing as they chased each other. Finally, Mr. Stevens turned to her, his expression more open. "Maybe I was too quick to judge. I'm willing to give this a chance." The exchange felt like a breakthrough. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Johnson and Mr. Stevens continued to talk, slowly chipping away at the walls of misunderstanding. It was a long journey, but for the first time, there was hope for real change. The potluck turned out to be a resounding success. Neighbors who had once turned away from her now approached with smiles, sharing stories and recipes. Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of belonging that had eluded her since moving in. But the journey didn't end there. She knew there was still work to be done, still people who held onto their prejudices, still a community that needed healing. Inspired by the success of the potluck, she decided to create a monthly gathering, a space where everyone could come together to share their experiences and build relationships. Each month, the gatherings grew, drawing in more neighbors. They shared food, laughter, and their stories. They discussed challenges, celebrated victories, and slowly began to understand one another. The initial animosity was replaced with respect, and the neighborhood began to transform. With each meeting, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of pride swell within her. She had faced adversity, and rather than let it break her, she had risen to the challenge. She had proven that love, kindness, and understanding could overcome even the deepest-seated prejudices. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson watched with joy as the children played together, parents formed friendships, and the community began to thrive. There were still hurdles to overcome, but the walls that had once divided them were crumbling, replaced by bridges of understanding. One sunny afternoon, she stood in her garden, surrounded by blooming flowers. The vibrant colors mirrored the joy she felt in her heart. A neighbor walked by, stopping to admire her handiwork. "Your garden looks beautiful," she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "Thank you. I love to share it with everyone," Mrs. Johnson replied, her heart swelling with pride. It was a small moment, but it encapsulated everything she had worked for. She had turned a community once filled with hostility into one filled with warmth and acceptance. And in doing so, she had not only claimed her place in the neighborhood, but she had also inspired change in the hearts of those around her. As she tended to her flowers, she knew that together, they were building something beautiful, a community where everyone could belong, where love triumphed over hate, and where every individual's story mattered. The tension in the neighborhood reached a tipping point when whispers began to turn into planning. The neighbors, driven by fear and prejudice, gathered in hushed tones at the local coffee shop, determined to take action. They were no longer content with passive-aggressive behavior. They wanted to confront Mrs. Johnson directly. "She doesn't belong here," one neighbor muttered, stirring her coffee nervously. "We can't let this continue." Another neighbor nodded in agreement. "We need to organize a meeting. It's time we stand up for our community." And so, the plan was set in motion. They decided to hold a formal meeting at the community center, where they could collectively voice their grievances and demand that Mrs. Johnson leave their neighborhood. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday evening, and the neighbors were buzzing with a mix of anxiety and determination. Unbeknownst to them, Mrs. Johnson had been working diligently behind the scenes, planning an event of her own for that same evening. Inspired by the success of the potluck and wanting to further bridge the gap between herself and her neighbors, she had invited everyone to a community gathering at her home. She envisioned an evening filled with laughter, sharing, and perhaps a little bit of healing. As the days ticked by, Mrs. Johnson spent her time preparing. She decorated her home with care, setting up tables and arranging chairs in her spacious backyard. She cooked her famous dishes, determined to show her neighbors the love she held in her heart. She hoped that by sharing her culture and her story, she could change some minds. Meanwhile, the neighbors' meeting loomed closer. They exchanged messages on social media, trying to rally as many people as possible to attend. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, but also with fear. Some were apprehensive about the confrontation they were about to instigate, but they felt a responsibility to stand up for what they believed was right. On the day of the meetings, the tension was palpable in both households. As evening fell, Mrs. Johnson stood in her kitchen, stirring a pot of gumbo and listening to the sounds of the neighborhood outside. Children laughed and played, families walked their dogs, and the scent of summer filled the air. She felt a wave of hope wash over her, believing that tonight could be the turning point in their relationship. As she set the last dish on the table, she took a moment to breathe. She believed in the power of community, and her heart swelled with anticipation for the evening ahead. She could envision her neighbors arriving, tasting her food, and slowly letting go of their prejudices. But across town, a different energy filled the community center. A group of neighbors gathered, their faces set in grim determination. They were ready to voice their concerns, to confront Mrs. Johnson, and demand she leave. The fear of the unknown fueled their resolve, but beneath it lay the unacknowledged awareness that perhaps their actions were rooted in something deeper. As the meeting began, the tension escalated. Neighbors took turns expressing their frustrations, rallying each other with slogans of "community first." Voices were raised, and emotions ran high. They spoke of their fears, their discomfort, and their growing disdain for that outsider living among them. "We need to protect our way of life," one neighbor exclaimed, her voice echoing in the room. "This isn't just about her, it's about our community's identity." But amid the fervor, a few neighbors hesitated. They exchanged glances, their faces reflecting doubt. One neighbor, who had previously expressed excitement about the potluck, spoke up, "But maybe we should at least hear her side of the story? I mean, she's been nothing but kind to us." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. The tension was palpable, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see how this would play out. "Are you really siding with her?" Another neighbor scoffed. "We can't let this continue." The dissent among the neighbors grew, the divide widening between those who wanted to confront Mrs. Johnson and those who were beginning to recognize the humanity within her. Meanwhile, Mrs. Johnson was putting the finishing touches on her evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she lit candles on her patio, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere. The smell of her cooking wafted through the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and chatter from her neighbors' homes. She could feel the pulse of the community around her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of optimism. When the time came for her guests to arrive, she welcomed each one with open arms, encouraging everyone to help themselves to the food. She smiled brightly, engaging in light conversation and laughter, determined to create a space where everyone felt at ease. However, as the evening wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that some of her neighbors were still holding back. She sensed their discomfort, their uncertainty. "Why don't we go around the table and share a little about ourselves?" Mrs. Johnson suggested, hoping to foster connection and understanding. "I think it would be great for all of us to learn about each other." One by one, her neighbors began to share their stories, where they came from, what they loved about the neighborhood, and the challenges they faced. It was a beautiful tapestry of lives woven together by shared experiences. But just as the mood began to lighten, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. Mrs. Johnson's heart sank as she opened it to find several neighbors from the earlier meeting standing there, their expressions grim. "Can we talk?" Mr. Stevens asked, his tone flat. Mrs. Johnson's mind raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she took a deep breath and invited them inside. She wasn't going to shy away from this confrontation. Instead, she would face it head-on. As the group entered, the atmosphere shifted. Those who had been enjoying the evening turned to watch, curiosity and concern evident in their expressions. Mrs. Johnson felt the tension rise again, but she was determined to remain calm. "Hello, everyone," she greeted the new arrivals. "I'm glad you could join us. We were just sharing our stories." Mr. Stevens cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We need to talk about your place in this neighborhood. There have been a lot of complaints." Mrs. Johnson interrupted gently. "I understand that there have been concerns, and I'd love the opportunity to hear them. But I think it's important for us to speak openly and honestly as neighbors." The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled in. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance to confront their fears and biases. Mr. Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "We just want to protect what we have here. This neighborhood has always been a certain way." Mrs. Johnson nodded, understanding the underlying fear. "I can appreciate that. Change is difficult, and it can feel threatening. But I'm not here to change who you are. I'm here to be part of this community, to contribute positively." Her words hung in the air, and she could see her neighbors considering them. She continued, "Perhaps we can find common ground. We're all human after all. We all want to feel safe and welcome in our homes." With that, the atmosphere began to shift again. The gathered neighbors looked at one another, uncertainty giving way to curiosity. One woman from the group spoke up, her voice trembling. "I just don't want things to change too much. I like it here." Mrs. Johnson smiled softly. "Change doesn't have to be bad. It can bring new perspectives, new experiences, and new friendships." The discussion continued, with neighbors expressing their concerns, but now they were also listening, really listening. Mrs. Johnson shared her own experiences, the challenges she faced as a Black woman, and the hope she held for building a community rooted in understanding and acceptance. Gradually, the wall of animosity began to crumble. Mrs. Johnson could feel it. The atmosphere lightened, and laughter started to weave back into the conversation as they shared memories and personal stories. Before long, the night shifted from confrontation to connection. They talked about their hopes for the neighborhood, the changes they wished to see, and how they could work together to foster a sense of belonging for everyone. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Johnson felt a profound sense of gratitude. This gathering, initially fraught with tension and potential conflict, had transformed into a celebration of community. Neighbors exchanged numbers, promising to keep in touch and continue their conversations. They left with smiles on their faces, and as Mrs. Johnson watched them walk away, she knew that the night had changed everything. A new chapter had begun, one where Mrs. Johnson was no longer seen as an outsider, but as a vital part of the community. Together, they were forging a future where understanding and respect took precedence over fear and prejudice. And as she cleaned up the remnants of the evening, she couldn't help but smile. The potluck had ignited something beautiful, a sense of belonging that extended beyond race and background, weaving them all together in a tapestry of humanity. This was just the beginning, and she was ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that with every challenge, there was an opportunity for growth, connection, and love. As the evening unfolded, Mrs. Johnson's home buzzed with a sense of anticipation. Neighbors who had once viewed her with skepticism now mingled freely, laughter echoing through the air. The atmosphere had transformed, filled with the warmth of newfound connections. Yet, Mrs. Johnson sensed that the real turning point of the evening was still to come. Just as she was about to suggest a group photo to commemorate the night, there was a sudden knock at the door. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned toward the entrance. Mrs. Johnson's heart raced. She had not anticipated any more guests. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, framed by the soft glow of her porch lights, was none other than the mayor. He wore a broad smile, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "Good evening, everyone," the mayor boomed, stepping inside and greeting Mrs. Johnson with a warm hug. "I couldn't resist the invitation. I've heard so much about this wonderful gathering, and I wanted to see it for myself." The neighbors were in disbelief. Whispers of, "Is that really the mayor?" floated through the room. Some exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to react. Mrs. Johnson, however, felt a rush of pride. She had invited the mayor, knowing that his presence could be a powerful statement about unity and acceptance. "Thank you for coming, Mayor," she said, trying to contain her excitement. "We're just getting to know each other and building a community." The mayor nodded, his expression turning serious as he turned to address the crowd. "I'm thrilled to be here, especially at an event that emphasizes the very essence of what makes our town great: community, friendship, and understanding." His words resonated deeply with everyone present, and they began to relax as he continued to speak. "I've known Mrs. Johnson for many years. She is a pillar of strength in our community, and her dedication to making our town a better place is truly inspiring." Gasps and murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Johnson had always kept her accomplishments relatively quiet, and to hear the mayor speak so highly of her was unexpected. She has worked tirelessly in various initiatives, helping those in need, promoting education, and advocating for inclusivity. Her presence here is a blessing, and it is vital that we come together to support one another, regardless of our backgrounds. The atmosphere shifted once more, and Mrs. Johnson could see the change in her neighbors' expressions. The skepticism began to melt away, replaced by admiration and respect. It was a critical moment. The bridge between misunderstanding and acceptance was slowly being built. Tonight, the mayor continued, is not just about a gathering. It's about acknowledging the diversity that makes our community stronger. Each of us has a story, and together, we can weave a narrative of hope and unity. As he spoke, Mrs. Johnson glanced around the room. She saw her neighbors nodding, engaged, and visibly moved. The tension that had once hung over the gathering was dissipating like morning mist, giving way to a clear, sunny day. The mayor paused, allowing his words to sink in before adding, "Let's celebrate our differences, our strengths, and our common humanity. Let's show the world what true community looks like." A round of applause erupted in the room, and Mrs. Johnson felt tears prick at her eyes. This was the moment she had dreamed of, a chance to bring her neighbors together in understanding and acceptance. The mayor turned to her, his expression warm and encouraging. "Mrs. Johnson, thank you for your commitment to our community. Your courage to reach out and invite us all here tonight is an example for us all. It takes bravery to confront prejudice, and your actions are paving the way for a brighter future." Overwhelmed, Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her heart racing. "Thank you, Mayor. It means the world to have your support. But this is a shared journey, and I believe that together, we can foster an environment where everyone feels welcome and valued." The applause swelled once more, and as her neighbors cheered, she felt a wave of hope wash over her. The mayor's words had transformed the evening into something much more significant, an affirmation that they could move past their differences. After the mayor's speech, he mingled with the guests, taking the time to talk to each person, listening to their stories and concerns. The once distant neighbors began to see him as an ally and, by extension, began to feel the same warmth toward Mrs. Johnson. As the evening progressed, neighbors who had once stood on opposing sides found common ground. They shared laughter and stories over food, discussing their dreams for the community and their hopes for the future. The night was filled with an energy that felt transformative, as if the barriers that had separated them were finally crumbling. Mrs. Johnson looked around her home, filled with neighbors who were now friends. The mayor's visit had changed everything. The unexpected twist of having him present had acted as a catalyst, igniting conversations and connections that may have never happened otherwise. As the gathering began to wind down, a neighbor approached Mrs. Johnson, his expression earnest. "I never realized how much we could have in common. I think we were all afraid of the unknown, but tonight has really opened my eyes." Mrs. Johnson smiled warmly. "It's about taking that first step together. We're all in this community, and we need to support one another. I'd love to help organize more events like this," he offered, enthusiasm evident in his voice. "Let's make this a regular thing." "Absolutely," she replied, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Let's continue to build this community together." As the last guests left, Mrs. Johnson stood on her porch, watching them walk away, their voices fading into the night. She felt a profound sense of accomplishment, knowing that the seeds of change had been planted. The unexpected twist of the evening had not only transformed the atmosphere but had also ignited a passion within her neighbors to work towards a more inclusive community. She understood that the journey ahead would not be without challenges, but with each step forward, they were moving closer to the vision she had held in her heart. And in that moment, as she looked up at the stars twinkling overhead, she felt hopeful. Change was possible, and it was beginning right here, in her neighborhood. As Mrs. Johnson closed the door behind her, she reflected on the power of community. It was about connection, understanding, and love, an experience that transcended race, background, and prejudice. Together, they were building something beautiful, and she was grateful to be a part of it. As the mayor's words hung in the air, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The once skeptical neighbors now stood in a state of disbelief, their attempts to ostracize Mrs. Johnson unraveling before them. The weight of their prejudices pressed heavily on their shoulders, made all the more acute by the presence of the very person they had sought to alienate. The mayor's arrival had inadvertently turned the tables, exposing the ugly truth of their actions. They had come together that night, not only to confront Mrs. Johnson but to solidify a wall of exclusion. Instead, they found themselves at the center of a gathering that championed unity and understanding. In the moments that followed the mayor's speech, Mrs. Johnson could see the shift in her neighbors' expressions. The whispers that had once floated through the neighborhood, laden with judgment and disdain, were now replaced with uncertainty. They exchanged glances, realizing that they were not just facing a new resident but a force for change supported by one of the most respected figures in the city. Feeling the gravity of the situation, Mrs. Johnson stepped forward once more, her voice steady and filled with grace. "I know this isn't easy for some of you," she began, looking directly at her neighbors. "Change often feels uncomfortable, but it's through these discomforts that we grow." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling in. The neighbors who had once banded together to push her out, now felt the tide of shame wash over them. They had come with intentions of confrontation, but now they were faced with an unexpected opportunity for reflection and growth. "Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never thought we needed," she continued, her tone warm and inviting. "What's important now is how we move forward. I believe that together we can create a community that is inclusive and understanding, a place where everyone feels at home." Mrs. Johnson paused, allowing her words to resonate. "I would like to invite each of you to future gatherings. Let's come together, share stories, and learn from one another. We have a chance to turn this situation around, to foster connections instead of division." She could see the flicker of recognition in her neighbors' eyes, the spark of hope igniting in the hearts that had once harbored resentment. For the first time, they were being offered a chance not just to apologize but to actively participate in something larger than themselves. One neighbor, a woman with a skeptical brow, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. I didn't understand who you were or what you stood for. I judged you based on assumptions instead of getting to know you." The words hung in the air, a powerful admission that seemed to resonate with others. One by one, neighbors began to echo similar sentiments, each expression of regret chipping away at the wall of prejudice that had separated them for so long. "Thank you for being willing to reach out to us," another neighbor chimed in. "We all have our flaws, and I think we can learn from this experience. I would love to be a part of the community you envision." As the evening progressed, Mrs. Johnson found herself surrounded by neighbors eager to engage, to connect. The gathering transformed into a collaborative conversation, where ideas flowed freely and laughter broke through the remnants of tension. The walls that had once stood firm began to crumble, replaced by a spirit of camaraderie. The mayor, observing the change, smiled approvingly. He felt that the seeds of unity were taking root. "This is what community looks like," he declared, his voice resonating with pride. "It takes courage to admit our mistakes and to move forward together. I encourage all of you to continue this dialogue, to build bridges instead of barriers." As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Johnson looked around at her neighbors, her heart swelling with gratitude. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of newfound respect and genuine desire to make amends. She had envisioned a community where everyone felt valued, and for the first time, she saw the glimmers of that dream coming to life. Before the last guest departed, she made a point to thank them for coming. "I truly appreciate each of you for being here tonight. Your willingness to open your hearts and minds means everything. Let's continue this journey together. I believe we can create something beautiful in this neighborhood." As the neighbors exchanged hugs and farewells, Mrs. Johnson felt a sense of relief wash over her. The challenges ahead would still exist, but they were no longer insurmountable. With open dialogue and shared experiences, they could work toward a better future, hand in hand. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to change. Mrs. Johnson organized community events that encouraged everyone to participate. Potlucks, movie nights, and volunteer opportunities flourished, fostering connections that transcended previous misunderstandings. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to collaborate, sharing their skills and resources for the benefit of all. One particularly memorable event was a neighborhood cleanup day, where everyone came together to beautify their surroundings. The once divided residents worked side by side, laughing and chatting as they cleared litter and planted flowers. The atmosphere was one of unity, and it was evident that the hard work was paying off. Mrs. Johnson felt a profound sense of satisfaction as she watched her neighbors transform. They were no longer strangers living in proximity, they were becoming friends and allies, advocating for one another in ways she had only hoped for. During one of the potlucks, a neighbor approached Mrs. Johnson with a project idea. "What if we started a community garden? It could be a place where everyone can contribute and enjoy fresh produce together." Excitement bubbled in Mrs. Johnson's chest. "That sounds wonderful. We can start planning right away." As they discussed the details, other neighbors began to chime in, offering their support and enthusiasm. The garden became a symbol of their journey, a tangible representation of their commitment to growth, both as individuals and as a community. Through these shared experiences, Mrs. Johnson saw the true meaning of resilience. The journey had not always been easy, but the lessons learned had deepened their connections. They had come to understand that their differences could be celebrated and that embracing one another's stories only strengthened their bond. The culmination of their efforts was a community block party, where everyone was invited to celebrate their progress. The mayor was there once again, joining in the festivities and praising the neighborhood for its growth. As people danced, shared food, and laughed together, Mrs. Johnson felt a profound sense of fulfillment. That night, she stood on her porch, watching the joyful chaos unfold before her. The laughter of her neighbors filled the air, and she felt a warmth in her heart, knowing that they had come so far together. As she joined the celebration, she reflected on the journey they had taken. The initial hostility she faced had transformed into a community of support, understanding, and love. Each person had played a role in this change, and she was grateful for every moment that had brought them closer. In the end, Mrs. Johnson's story was one of resilience and hope. It was a testament to the power of community and the capacity for change when hearts are open. Together, they had rewritten the narrative, proving that unity could triumph over prejudice, and that through understanding, they could build a brighter future. And as the night drew to a close, she looked around at her neighbors, her friends, and felt an overwhelming sense of pride. They had created something beautiful together, a community rooted in acceptance and love, and she knew that they were just getting started.